We are going to start with a very interesting series of sections now. This is related with the complex controllers. Basically, the complex controllers are controllers that in some of those operations need to use two or more resources. For example, in this case, we are going to implement the index method of the transaction category controller. Basically, the index method of this controller is going to return the categories for a specific transaction. As you may know, there does not exist any relationship between transaction and category. So we need to go through different resources or models to obtain that. In this case, the categories of a transaction are the categories of the product that is part of that transaction. So it's going to be a little simple operation, but equally still being complex because in this case needs to use transactions and categories. So for this, let's create first the transaction category controller using again PHP Artisan. So we have a transaction category controller that is going to be inside the transaction folder, and this is going to be a resource controller using the transaction model inside. So after this, we can go to our code and we can see there our controller. For this specific controller, we just need the index method because we only want to obtain the list of the categories for a specific transaction. We don't need anything else. For example, we don't want to obtain the specific category for a specific transaction because we can basically go directly to obtain that category. So we don't need the transaction at all. But to obtain the list of categories for that transaction, we need to perform a little different operation. Let's go to create the routes for this new controller, specifically for transactions. So we have now transactions and categories. We just have to separate the different resources using a dot, and now we are going to use the transaction category controller only with the index method. After this, we are able to implement this. First, we need the instance of the transaction. And once we have the transaction, we can obtain the product of this and from the product obtain the categories. This is basically through the relationship with product and through the relationship between product and categories, we can obtain this. So basically, we have the list of categories for this specific transaction and we just need to return it. Remember to extend from API controller, and which will be done now. Let's verify. So we will obtain the categories for the transaction with ID number 1. We can see this list working as expected, and of course we can specify different transactions. If the transaction does not exist, we are going to obtain a regular 404 not found exception. We have completely implemented our first complex operation in our RESTful API. See you in the next class.